What's up, football fans? Welcome to the Extra Point. I am your host, Phil Ruskin. Super excited to bring you episode 2, and we are going to be diving into the Dynasty Rebuild show tonight. So, really excited to have everybody here. As always, please feel free to jump into the comments. Make sure you are listening along. I'll give a couple announcements here at the top, and then we'll dive right into the content. So, a couple exciting things that are coming up right now. Obviously, you know what to do. Hit that subscribe button. Make sure that you are tuned in every week as I will be going live Thursday nights at 7 p.m. Pacific time. Obviously, really excited to bring you exclusive Dynasty content on a weekly basis. Follow me on Instagram, the underscore extra point underscore FFB. And then a really exciting announcement. Super excited to tell you guys tonight. I am now listed officially on Spotify, and I'm also on Patreon. So make sure you jump over to both of those platforms if you can't tune in live every Thursday, or if you're just not a video cast person. No stress. Make sure you jump on to Spotify. You can see the ticker running across the bottom here. So you can jump on to Spotify or Patreon if you're more of a podcast kind of audio only person. As always, share my content with your leagues, family, friends. Obviously, we're a Dynasty football community trying to build the brand and certainly trying to make sure that we've got a growing group, and we love to support the community. Lastly, I've got a ton of leagues. You know where to find me. Hit that button on Sleeper at PRuskin. You know how you can find me for leagues from free, ranging all the way to the big money leagues. So if you're new to Dynasty, if you're looking for an opportunity to get involved, hit me up, and I will definitely make sure we find the right league for you. Couple announcements, and really excited to tell you that tomorrow, June 7th, you can tune in to Get Right Fantasy Network. They are my partners. They are my affiliate platform here. Get Right Fantasy Network is going to be hosting a show tomorrow night with special guest Jim Coventry from RotoWire. Jim and Tycoon will be participating in a Scott Fishbowl mock draft, so make sure that you jump in and check that show out. I will be there. It's going to be awesome. Really stoked to have Jim come on to the show. And obviously, big shout out to my guys at Get Right. If you aren't familiar with Scott Fishbowl, it is the world's largest charity best ball tournament. It's a ton of fun, and it is hosted by Underdog Fantasy. Make sure you jump on Underdog Fantasy if you are looking to get involved with your best ball leagues. Next week, two really exciting announcements. We will be going through actually a bonus episode on Wednesday at 6:30 p.m. Pacific. We're going to be live streaming a draft called the Super Bowl, and it will be an auction draft. So if you want to jump on, get some tips and tricks for auction, if you've never seen an auction draft, if you're new to Dynasty and thinking about getting into an auction draft, definitely recommend checking out the stream. It's going to be a lot of fun. I'll be participating, so I don't know how much I'm going to be commentating, but I'm going to do my best to make sure that I'm giving some advice while not completely tipping my own hand of cards. I'm trying to win the league. And then next Thursday, the day after, instead of a regular episode of The Extra Point, we'll be live streaming a separate Dynasty auction draft. That's going to be one of my leagues called the Annexation of Puerto Rico. Shout out to all the 90s kids, a little reference to the Little Giants. And you can catch that at 4 p.m. Pacific time, 7 p.m. Eastern. And then stay tuned next week and next weekend for special content where I'll break down and analyze the drafts for all the Dynasty players. If you've yet to experience an auction draft, if you're looking for some auction strategies, the post-draft shows, that's what you're really going to want to tune into, as we'll go through some of the players where I see a lot of value, maybe some guys that overpaid, some teams that I like. Hopefully my team turns out really well, and we'll make sure to bring you a ton of content. As you can see coming through the bottom, make sure to hit that subscribe button. You can follow me on Instagram, and I am now listed on Patreon and Spotify. So really excited to have everybody here tonight. And without further ado, let's get into it. So if there's one universal truth about Dynasty, it's that everybody at some point is going to have to rebuild. Now, this can be a soft rebuild. It can be a full rebuild. It could be a complete overhaul of your roster. But at some point, you're going to have to actually jump in and rebuild some of your team. And that's just the truth of it. And I mentioned last week, and I've mentioned many times in some of my written articles, I play Dynasty in a 2 to 3 year window. And again, I hope that you are too. Everybody wants to go and grab, the top rookies and the best players and just put their team on autopilot. Oh, my team's going to be great for the next 5 to 10 years. maybe that's true and maybe that's not. But the one true thing is you have to still, even though it's a dynasty league and we are, having longevity with a lot of our players, you still have to play for this season as well. So I think one of the biggest questions that folks want to know is, how do I know if I'm in a rebuild? And the cop out answer is only you can decide that. But the real answer is I look at it as evaluating two separate factors. The first factor is my current roster, is it good enough? Like, is it good enough to win this season? And then the second caveat to that is, what picks do I currently have? And I'll kind of break those into two separate parts because I think it's really important. And then what I'm going to do is obviously jump in and put some content on the screen and show you a team that I rebuilt. Well, I'm still rebuilding it, but I think it'll help really illustrate visually kind of what I'm talking about. So I think if you look at, that first question I asked, right? Like, is my roster good enough to win this season? Well, let's say that you have two wide receivers and they're Devontae Adams and Tyreek Hill. Fantastic. Everybody would be excited to have those players, but they're getting older. They are expiring commodities. We know at the end of the day that Devontae Adams, yeah, he's going to be the target leader in Las Vegas, but he's only got probably 2 years left. And Tyreek Hill has told us that he's probably going to retire in the next 2 years. So for this season, right, like last season, Tyreek was the wide receiver 2 behind CeeDee Lamb. He can win you a week by himself. Everyone knows Tyreek Hill. You know what he's capable of. Devontae Adams saw 175 targets last season, second only to CeeDee Lamb. Volume is king in fantasy football. Look, I think Gardner Minshew is an upgrade over Aiden O'Connell, and I don't expect him to be a long-term starter, but I think he's an upgrade this season. And Devontae finished wide receiver 11 last year with constant quarterback turnover. Yes, there were some weeks when he went absent, and there were some weeks when he just completely disappeared. But at the end of the day, he's the kind of player that also is going to get so much volume. He's going to volume his way to a good season. So I think if you're, looking at, can I win now? Those are some win now players that, you might want to say, look, if I can't win and I have those kinds of players, and I'll talk about some of this in a second, like, that's what makes me a win now team. But how do I get out of those guys? And it's tough. And that's what I want to talk about here in just a couple minutes and illustrate for you. I did yesterday a 12-team PPR, one quarterback mock draft. And I just really wanted to do kind of an ADP price check just to get a better sense of kind of some of these older wide receivers that are clearly on win now teams, that are guys that are expiring commodities. And Tyreek Hill went at the 102. Sorry, this was a 12-team one quarterback. Tyreek Hill went at the 102. Devontae Adams at the 204. Steph Diggs at the 210. Mike Evans at the 402, and Cooper Kupp at the 407. These are players that, again, they're not players that you want to invest heavily into. They're guys that are on win now teams. But what the ADP price check, and the point I'm trying to illustrate for everyone, is they're players that in redraft, I know this is a dynasty show, but in redraft, the value is there for this season. So again, if these are guys that you see on your rosters, you're probably a win now team. And that's okay. And I think for me, the second question we wanted to ask again about, like, how do I know if it's time to rebuild? What picks do I have? So I'll cover the picks in a little bit, because the picks will determine, what you could potentially get or what you're targeting. If you're a team that's, going for the championship, you're probably going to end up with late firsts, late seconds. If you're looking to rebuild and you're trying to move pieces, you're obviously trying to move up to the earlier parts of the first and second round with some higher draft capital. So I also want to look at, do I have a positional advantage at a onesie position? The onesie positions are the quarterback and the tight end position, because you only are really required to start one a week. Now, most people will do super flex. So I think that at the end of the day, I still consider a second quarterback in super flex still kind of a onesie position. I think if you've watched, our Get Right Fantasy channel, the mock drafts, and you've seen me in the last 3 or 4 of those, my strategy is usually a hero QB, where I try to target one of the top 6 to 7 quarterbacks in the draft, and then I'll fill in a QB2 with someone that I think is going to be a QB2, because I want to load up on wide receivers and running backs. So if you have Travis Kelce is an expiring commodity. He is still going in redraft as the tight end 1. So for this season, even though his usage could go down because they're saving him for the playoffs, I understand the narrative. But Travis Kelce is a player that can help you win this year. And again, you're not getting a huge return if you're trying to sell. So I think what we want to ask, if you evaluate that roster, older teams that look more like a redraft team, you probably want to make a run at the championship. And if you're a win now team, I, I just want to say this because I think it's really important. I'm not a huge fan of going all in and selling all your draft picks, because if you don't win the championship, you can really set your team back a couple of years. So what I'm going to illustrate here on the screen in a couple of seconds, again, it's not a flex. It's not me trying to show whoa, what a great master class of trading that you did. The team sucked and it's in a rebuild. And I wanted to show you that I'm still in a rebuild, but I don't want to be in a rebuild for 3 years. I want to be in it for 2 years. And so the reason I want to bring up this team here in just a couple of minutes is I think it'll help show you how I prioritize trying to build out a specific room rather than just trying to overhaul my roster to get every good player I could get and actually try to win a championship this season. The cupboard was barren to start with. So let me go ahead and just kind of jump in here and show you guys what this looks like, because I think this is a really good example of how to rebuild a team when the cupboard is absolutely barren. This league is called the Pro Bowl, and it's a league that is going into our 3rd year this season. So it was a league that started, sorry, I got to bring it up. It's a league that started 2 years ago, and you can kind of see my spreadsheet here, and this is how I evaluate. And I mentioned this last week. This is what my teams usually look like on paper: red for quarterbacks, green for running backs, blue for the wide receivers, and orange for the tight ends. If you're listening on Patreon, if you're listening on Spotify, I know you can't see this, so I'll do my best to kind of talk through what this actually looks like so you can visually understand it. But also jump on, hang out with us. It's a really good time on Thursday nights. So I wanted to show this here because it's important. I started the season, you all can see, I started this coming into this draft with Joe Burrow, Rachaad White, and Trey McBride. That's it. That was all I had as far as useful pieces on this team. Didn't have anybody else that could possibly be any sort of value. And so I had 5 first-round picks, and the downside of this, and this is why I chose this team, I had the late-round picks. I didn't have the 101 through the 105. I had the 106, 7, 8, 11, and 12. So I had the back half of the first round, and obviously this is a one-quarterback league, so the wide receivers that you really wanted, they all got pushed up the board. So again, starting in a one-quarterback league with Joe Burrow, I feel great about that. He's got a contract. He's foundational. He's someone that I'm certainly going to build around. Rachaad White, look, I don't love Rachaad White. I like Rachaad White. I think he's going to be just fine this season. His value should hold into next year, but I also don't know what that team's going to look like in Tampa with Chris Godwin and Mike Evans getting older. And it looks like Rachaad White's team. There's a new offensive coordinator this season with Dave Canales having gone on to Carolina. So I felt okay because, again, the cupboard was so barren. And Trey McBride at tight end, I have Trey McBride as the tight end 3 right now. So to me, I think he's going to be great in Arizona with a healthy Kyler, and obviously going to be probably I shouldn't say obviously. I think he'll probably be the wide receiver 2 in that league, kind of the de facto tight end wide receiver hybrid combination, catching passes. So the way that this started, players going off the board at the 101, pretty chalky, Marvin Harrison Jr. At the 102, Malik Neighbors. At the 103, Rome Odunze. At the 104, Brian Thomas Jr. And at the 105, Xavier Worthy. So again, I'm specifically targeting wide receivers. This was a really deep class. I missed out on all of the big 3, obviously, having the 106 as my earliest pick. And I chose to draft Ladd McConkey. I like Ladd McConkey. I think he's going to be a good player for the Chargers. I think he's going to be a wide receiver 2 as his ceiling. I don't see a world where he can crack the top 12. It's just not his archetype. He never did it at Georgia. He's not someone who's super dominant in terms of like red zone targets. His body's just not going to be a contested catch guy. But I think he's going to sit in zone really well. I think with the way that the Chargers want to run the ball, McConkey's going to be a really safe floor, maybe not a super high ceiling, but a really safe floor. And so for me, that's the direction I chose to go at the 106, to just get some youth into my team and to try to get a little bit of, volume on a team where I'm not a Quentin Johnston fan. I just don't think he's going to be very good. And Josh Palmer's Josh Palmer. So to me, McConkey is this season probably the wide receiver one. And obviously, we'll see if that changes and what's going to happen going forward. But for me, it was a good selection at the 106. And at the 107, I mentioned this last week, and this is what I wanted to point out. Please write down your trades. It takes like 10 seconds. Just make sure you write them down. It's really easy to do. It helps to understand what you're giving up and what's coming in, and then to look back on it, because players' values will change. That's the truth of Dynasty, is that a player, Austin Eckler is the best example of this. Austin Eckler was the RB1 and then the RB2 for Los Angeles for the last 3 years, excuse me. And then this past season, man, it just fell off a cliff. And now he's in Washington. It's probably, I think at best a 50-50 timeshare, but I just don't see it that way. I think Brian Robinson will get more of the first and second down work, and Austin Eckler will get the third down work. So values change. Players' values are going to change from year to year, and that's Dynasty. What we're all looking for ultimately in Dynasty is going to be players whose values are going to increase or at least hold at a bare minimum. Obviously, we know with age we're going to get depreciating assets, but ultimately we're trying to find youth with upside. And so I chose at the 107. I got a trade offer. And James in this league, he goes by Big Chungus. I might have him on the show here in a little bit. He and I have gone back and forth. And I'm not the biggest Kyren. Like, I like Kyren. I don't love Kyren. I think Kyren is going to be good. I think it will be difficult for him to repeat what he did last season, but I still see him as an RB1. And Sean McVay likes him. And I think Sean McVay likes him so much to the point where, yeah, they drafted my brain just go blank. Not Blake Corum. He went to the Chargers. Well, it'll come back to me. But at this point, Kyren, I think, is still the guy, in Los Angeles, and I think he will be. We know he's got some injury history, but I looked at Jonathan Brooks. I considered him there, and I really thought Jonathan Brooks, Trey Benson, in my opinion, were the only two, and I still believe this, are the only two running backs in this year's rookie draft class that you really want. I think Blake Corum's going to have some value. I think Jalen Wright's going to have some value. I think Marshawn Lloyd's going to have some value. And look, we know that someone's going to emerge. Somebody emerges every year out of nowhere. Isaiah Pacheco was a sixth or seventh round, I think a seventh round draft pick. He came out of nowhere and took Clyde's job, and Clyde was the 32nd or 31st or 32nd pick there, right? So I think for me, it's important to note that rookies bust, and there's rookies that will have value later. I like what I saw from Kyren last year. I know the injury history is a little bit scary, but ultimately I do think that Kyren's going to hold his value at least for this season and the next season. And again, I play Dynasty in a 2 to 3 year window. So I look at this trade. I don't know if you can see my mouse or not, but I traded Gabe Davis, Jerome Ford, and the 107 for Kyren Williams. Look, if you go to Keep Trade Cut and you put that in, the draft analyzer is probably going to say that I didn't get a good trade. I didn't win the trade. Whatever. I don't care. I've said this about trading a ton of times. When you trade, if you bring someone into your team that makes your team better, you won the trade. If you make the playoffs or win the championship, you won the trade. Now, my roster, you can see it here. It's not making the playoffs and it's not winning the championship. But I brought in a player that I believe is going to hold value, has RB1 upside. And yeah, I might have overpaid, but I'll tell you why in my mind, outside of making my team better, I don't think I overpaid. I don't believe in Gabe Davis. I think Gabe Davis will do what Gabe Davis always does. He will give you 3 for 64 and 2 touchdowns. And then the next week, he'll give you 2 for 12. And the week after that, he'll give you 3 for 16. And you'll just rip your hair out every single week trying to figure out which is the right week to start Gabe Davis. And the truth of Gabe Davis is, draft him in best ball. Just do it there, because then you don't have to worry about the volatility on a weekly basis. I don't want Gabe Davis on my dynasty teams. I don't play a lot of redraft, but I don't want him on my redraft teams. I love Gabe Davis as a mid to late round target on my best ball teams. So to me, giving up Gabe Davis wasn't a big issue. Jerome Ford is interesting because I think at the end of the day, we just don't know what's happening with Nick Chubb. He came out yesterday or today, I don't remember when the interview was, and he was like, look, I'm where I'm supposed to be. I don't have a timeline. And I think at the end of it all, he's got 2 massive knee injuries. He's 28 years old. I was talking on my buddy Kendall's show yesterday, the Fantasy Football Tavern. Make sure you check his channel out. We were talking of kind of about, range of outcomes for some of the early round players. Deshaun Watson's name came up. I just think Cleveland is trending down. I just don't like their offense a ton. And so to me, Jerome Ford probably has early season value, but with the Browns restructuring Nick Chubb's contract, Nick Chubb probably gets the lion's share of the work the second half of the year. So if I look at this trade on paper, in my mind, I really traded Jonathan Brooks and Jerome Ford for Kyron Williams, and I'm okay with that. And if I lose on paper, whatever, I don't care. My team's not winning this season anyway. But it was a question of, do I draft Jonathan Brooks straight up, or do I try to grab a player that I've seen do it at the NFL level on an offense with the Rams that I project to be better than the Panthers? And yeah, they have some injury history, both Brooks and Williams, but I like what I've seen from Kyron, and ultimately that to me was the safer pick. My next pick at the 108, I drafted Keon Coleman straight up. I like Coleman. I think his upside is there. I think he's going to eventually become the wide receiver 1 in Buffalo for Josh Allen. I mentioned this, I think, last week, but I've mentioned it before, in some written articles and some other shows that I've actually been a guest on. To me, James Cook and Dalton Kincaid were the big winners in the Steph Diggs trade going to Houston. But I also think there's a big market share for Keon Coleman to inherit. Ultimately, I think there's going to be volatility with touchdowns because Josh Allen's propensity to run. But Keon Coleman, to me, is a contested catch guy. He's a big body player. He played basketball at Michigan State before transferring to Florida State. So you want that with somebody who can, quote unquote, jump up and grab a rebound, which is your contested catch situation. So I really am very high on Keon Coleman. He's a nice piece for me to build around for the future going forward in my wide receiver room. And I'll cover a little bit of kind of what happened as this draft played out here. I made some trades after the draft. But then to me, Keon Coleman was just best player available and an easy pick at the 108. At the 109, Brock Bowers went, and at the 110, I actually traded up. And you can see that trade right here. I traded the 111, which was my pick coming up, and the 312, so the last pick of the draft, which became Brendan Rice. So I traded what became Blake Corum and Brendan Rice for Trey Benson. And Blake Corum going to the Rams. Look, the one thing about Blake Corum I think people need to remember, even though Kyron's there, Blake Corum scored 27 touchdowns in his last 2 seasons at Michigan. Touchdowns translate to the NFL. It's actually one of the stickiest stats that translates really, really well. So, look, is he going to take Kyron's job? Probably not if Kyron's healthy, but he might vulture some touchdowns. So, to me, it's okay. I think Trey Benson is set up to be possibly the RB1 in this class, maybe even better than Brooks. And the reason I say that is simply because of Arizona's offense. Kyler Williams, Kyler Murray. Let's try that again. Kyler Murray's fully healthy. He does run. Obviously, we know what Kyler is capable of. But if you look at their offense, you've got a young Marvin Harrison Jr., generational prospect. I don't love that term, generational prospect. We'll talk about that another night. But I do think the kid is going to be a top 5 wide receiver in the league within a couple of years. And he should obviously be a target monster here in his rookie season. Michael Wilson. He's okay. And Trey McBride, I mentioned him earlier. As you can see, he's on my tight end here on this team. I think he's the kind of de facto wide receiver too. James Conner's still there. He's going to be relevant this season. James Conner's injury history has always been the same. He's probably going to miss a couple of games. I don't know that he's played a full season in the last 5 years. So to me, Trey Benson is set up for success in year 2. I think he'll contribute this year. If Conner misses time, obviously he'll be a really good asset. But ultimately, I think Trey Benson is going to inherit a really, really big share of the Lions, or a lion's share of the work in Arizona on an offense we like, on an offense we project in year 2 with Kyler Murray, Trey McBride, Trey Benson, and Marvin Harrison Jr. To me, that's a pretty high-scoring offense. So I'm excited about Trey Benson. I think he's another good young piece that I can build around. So if you look at my slow rebuild here on the left, you can see my starting lineup. After a couple of picks, I now have Joe Burrow, Rachaad White, newly acquired Kyron Williams. I'll cover Jalen Waller in a second. Keon Coleman, and Trey McBride. So I'm starting to build out a better, at least starting lineup. I have absolutely no depth. In Dynasty, you have to have depth because of you basically there is no waiver wire. So you're basically streaming positions from your own bench. And that's okay. Again, look at the cupboard. I started with 3 guys. So I think for me, it's really important, again, as I mentioned, write your trades down, understand player values, and write down what the players that you, excuse me, the picks that you traded away, write down what those players become. So you can see here, I didn't just trade the 111 and the 312. The 111 became Blake Corum, the 312 became Brennan Rice. Write that down because that matters in the end. So again, I'm at the 110. I traded up to grab Benson. At the 111, Blake Corum went. And then at the 112, this was a trade that I kind of fired a ton of trades out on draft day. I probably sent out 10 to 11 trades at the 112. And this is what I got back for the 112. It became Caleb Williams. Again, it's a 2-quarterback league, so solid pick to get the QB1 in the class at 1-2 turn. But I got Joe Mixon and Zach Moss. Joe Mixon and Zach Moss on paper aren't sexy. It's not Bijan Robinson. It's not Breece Hall. It's not Jahmyr Gibbs. And that's fine. But again, with me rebuilding, the first thing that's really important, I got a 2-for-1. Number 2 thing that's really important, not only did I get a 2-for-1, meaning 2 players in for 1 player out, but I got 2 players that have value this season, and I think will have value next season. So Joe Mixon, we'll start there. Mixon's on an offense that you want to have pieces of. If you're in redraft, if you're in Dynasty, except for I'm going to just poo-poo on Steph Diggs for a minute. I don't want Steph Diggs on the team. I just don't. He's an expiring asset. I think he's a head case ultimately. I think he's on a 1-year contract, and they just paid Nico. Tank's on a rookie contract. They've already paid Dalton Schultz. They've paid Joe Mixon. I think it's a 1-year prove-it deal for Diggs in Houston. But Joe Mixon's going to have value in that offense. And C.J. Stroud does not run. He's not a real threat to vulture goal line touchdown work. So I think you're going to see Joe Mixon hold value this season and next. And then similarly with Zach Moss. Like Zach Moss inherited the Joe Mixon role in Cincinnati. Again, on an offense we love with Joe Burrow, with T. Higgins, with Jamar Chase. Joe Burrow doesn't run. He's not going to vulture touchdowns. And, Zach Moss did really well playing for Indy last year. I do think that Zach Moss is a player that if he plays well this season, probably retains the job for next year. And I think the question you have to ask yourself if you're looking at a player like a Zach Moss, quite simply is, do you believe in Chase Brown? And I don't. And I'm not going to go so far as to say he's irrelevant because I certainly think he's going to mix in and be a part of their offense. But what I've seen from Chase Brown doesn't inspire me to believe that he's going to be the guy, that he's going to take the lion's share of the work, that he's really going to take and remove snaps, from Zach Moss. So I was really stoked with that trade to pull that off. I think Victorious, there he is. He's in the chat here. He can keep me honest on this, but one of the guys in our league was like, dang, P. Ruskin, that's my name on Sleepers, P. Ruskin. It's like, dang, P. Ruskin's like Howie Roseman over there pulling off all these trades. So that's what you have to do in a rebuild. And obviously you want to win the championship. Everybody does. That's why we play Dynasty. It's why we play fantasy football. If you're not a team that's competing for the championship, I actually think rebuilding is way more fun than just simply jumping in and, being a middle of the pack team who's just kind of hoping and trying to get to the playoffs. So for me, this is obviously a team that's still has a long way to go, but it was a lot of fun for the last, couple of weeks leading up to the draft. And then obviously in the draft to pull off a lot of these trades. As we move forward, I didn't have any second rounders, so I missed a good chunk of the draft, no problem. But I did have the 303 and a guy, I don't remember where he was in the draft, probably 305, 306, but he wanted to move up. And I ended up looking at my board and saying, man, I need a piece, I need a receiver, and I need a cheap receiver. So I ended up trading the 303, which became Kamani Vidal, and the 2025 third for DeAndre Hopkins. DeAndre Hopkins is old. DeAndre Hopkins is probably on his last contract in Tennessee. Maybe he gets a 1-year extension. But I just needed someone that would get me through the season to have a physical body to actually put, on the field to catch passes. Because if you look at the rest of my team Michael Gallup, Greg Dortch, Devontae Parker, who just retired. I can take him off the team, actually. I'll do that right now live. There you go. Kendrick Bourne, Van Jefferson. Like, these aren't players you can use. You can't. They're going to get you zeros. I mean, the most they're going to get you is like 2 or 3 points a week. So DeAndre Hopkins with Calvin Ridley, in Tennessee. I think Will Levis is interesting. He's not a player I was really high on last year in the draft process. I don't really think he's a first-round quarterback, and the NFL didn't think he was a first-round quarterback, and you saw that with him dropping. He was, he's going to be a top 5 guy. He's going to be a top 10 guy. He dropped all the way to the top of the second round. Came out last year, and if my memory's right, threw like 4 touchdowns and like 300 yards in his debut, and then came right back down to earth. So I think he's interesting. I think he's got to play well this year. I think it's a really important year for him, but he's going to throw. I'm not super huge believer that the backfield is going to be this, volume that we used to see for Pollard and for Spears that we once saw with Derrick Henry. So I think DeAndre Hopkins and Calvin Ridley are going to get targets. And, ultimately what I'm looking for from DeAndre Hopkins is some touchdown upside. Again, it's a rebuild. I just needed someone to kind of get me through the season because I've got first and second round picks. You can see my picks up here. I've got 2 firsts and 3 seconds going into next year. And I've got 2 firsts in 2026. So I have draft capital that I can do one of 2 things with. Draft the best available players, or if it happens to be that some of these picks turn out like my picks did this year, where they were later picks, trade and try to acquire some more valuable veterans. And that's ultimately what I did here in this last trade that I'll kind of go through. I told you all that I drafted Ladd McConkey, was really high on him in the process. I drafted him at the 106, and then I traded him. And the reason I traded him, quite simply, is I had a chance to get Jalen Waddle. And so for me, you can see the trade here. Ladd McConkey, Zach Charbonnet, and Greg Dulcich for Jalen Waddle in the 2026 second. I'm in a rebuild. In a rebuild, I'm looking again for 2 things. I'm looking for young, youthful players with upside that I can make as foundational pieces, or I'm looking for picks because I want to ultimately, picks are currency. I want to package that with potentially a player, or I want to trade to try to grab somebody else. So to me, Zach Charbonnet is clearly the running back 2. He's not the 1B. KW3 is the 1A. Sorry, is the 1, not the 1A. And Greg Dulcich, look, he lost the whole season last year with the hamstring. So I have Trey McBride. I'm not a big tight end drafter. I just don't really believe in having a ton of tight ends on my roster. And I certainly don't believe in having tight end, 7 to 15 on my roster. Like, if you don't have one of the top 3, top 4, maybe tight ends that are game breakers, that are really giving you that positional scarcity value, there's really not that much difference from a point projection and even from the end of the year finish between tight end 7 and tight end 15. It's just, there's not. It might be 10 or 15 points. So everyone's super high on McConkey, and I get it, right? Like, Justin, you've all seen on Instagram the memes of, Justin Herbert standing in the front yard, throwing the ball over the house, running through the house and catching it himself. And that was like, oh, who's Justin Herbert going to throw it to? Well, they lost Keenan Allen. They lost Mike Williams. And they even lost Gerald Everett, which, again, isn't sexy. But, like, Gerald Everett scored a couple of touchdowns last year. And I think what people are projecting for Ladd McConkey is that he's going to be this super high volume wide receiver 1, 1,000 yards and 10 touchdowns. I don't see it. And I think everybody who's, seen Jim Harbaugh and Greg Roman offense, we all know they're going to run the ball. I don't think that means that Justin Herbert's value is nothing. I think the pendulum has swung too far, and the panic has been overly panicked in the sense of, like, Justin Herbert's still going to be a good quarterback. He's a very good quarterback. He's got a big contract. They're going to bring guys in. And here's the 2 reasons I chose to make this trade. Number 1, I have seen Jalen Waddle be a wide receiver 1 with Tua. Tyreek Hill says he's going to retire after next season. We'll see if that happens or not. But even if he doesn't, guys, he's 31 years old. So at some point, even though he's superhuman and he's an outlier, similar to like Christian McCaffrey and even Travis Kelce, at some point, either he's going to retire or there's going to be, the age cliff and the downside of Tyreek Hill. I've said this before. I'll say it again. I'm cool riding off into the sunset with Tyreek Hill. He can win you a week. He's fantastic. I love him, but it doesn't last forever. So I found myself looking at Jalen Waddle. This is the second reason I made the trade and saying, you know what? I really think that at the end of the 2 years here, and this was before this week, obviously, when Jalen Waddle got paid. I think Jalen Waddle is going to be the wide receiver one. I think they're going to pay Tua, and then of course, we're about a month after the rookie draft, or maybe 2 months now after the rookie draft. Jalen Waddle just got the bag. So Miami's telling you, we value you, we like you, we think you're the guy. And the thing with Tua, he's going to get paid. Tua has supported Tyreek and Jalen Waddle both in the same season as wide receiver ones, similar to how Jalen Hurts supported A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith in the same season as wide receiver ones. So I took what I think is a safer prospect with true wide receiver one upside. And look, if Ladd McConkey comes out and kills it and becomes a wide receiver one, then awesome. But I still think it's a fair trade because Ladd McConkey is a wide receiver one on a good offense with Jalen Waddle, wide receiver one on a good offense. I think the ceiling for Waddle is higher and probably not alone in that take. So to me, drafting McConkey, being able to flip him to grab a Jalen Waddle and a pick, to me was tremendous value. So I want to pause here. I'll go through some of the other kind of older trades to how I even got to this spot in the beginning, but we've got some comments here that I want to bring up because I think it's really important making sure we get everybody, some questions answered. Wicked Pompano, what's up, buddy? Good to see you, man. I know you and I have exchanged a bunch of messages. So do you find any value for someone that's rebuilding by drafting a Nix Franklin stack? I think it's a good question. I think it's an interesting question because you're going to get Nix. This is rookie draft. You're going to get Nix in the second, and you're going to get Franklin in the third, maybe even the fourth. I think it's a good play if you're rebuilding for two reasons. Number one, Bo Nix is look. If you guys have seen some of the camp videos, Zach Wilson's out there, and they're going, "Oh, Zach Wilson's the starter, and he's getting all the reps with the ones." Bo Nix is going to be the starter for the Broncos. It's just a question of time. I've mentioned it at least twice in this show, and again, I'll just keep harping on it. I play Dynasty in a 2 to 3 year window. Bo Nix is probably going to be the starter for at least 2 to 3 years in Denver, unless he's just awful. I'm out on Troy Franklin. I know in Dynasty we've got a lot of people that are ageist. They all want youth. We all want youthful players with high upside. I need somebody that's got a little bit more weight on him. Troy Franklin scares me a little bit. I know every player in the NFL is one hit away from their season being over. But what I will say about Franklin, outside of the concerns I have, the upside case is this. I don't think Courtland Sutton is a Denver Bronco next season. Nix and Franklin went to Oregon together, so they've got a rapport, they've got a friendship there, and I do think that's important, right? You look at Cooper Kupp and Matthew Stafford a couple years ago when Stafford first came to the Rams, and they were part of the breakfast club, racing each other to the facility to eat breakfast together and watch film. And that kind of stuff matters. I think that's why people are so excited about Caleb Williams and Rome Odunze coming in, being friends in the draft process. So for me, drafting Nix and Franklin is good because they're cheap. The concern that I have with Nix and Franklin is I don't know that what their value is going to do. And I think when I project out certain players, for example, like Drake May. I think Drake May's value is going to hold. And I think if the Patriots can draft well or trade and bring in a big free agent signing, his value is going to increase. I don't know that there's a world and a path that Nix and Franklin become a QB1 wide receiver 2 duo. I just don't project Denver to be a very high scoring offense. They only had a couple of draft picks this season. Courtland Sutton probably isn't going to be on the team next year, so that helps Franklin. But again, you just don't know who they're going to sign in free agency. Marvin Mims is there. I'm not a big believer in Javonte. So I think for me, going with a player like Bo Nix is really interesting because you can get, a quarterback 2 if it's a super flex league that's probably pretty safe. And then hopefully, Pompano, hopefully you have a QB1 and or you're trading for a really high ceiling QB1. So good question. Definitely something that I like, in terms of stacking. That's always valuable. But my kind of follow-up question for you, and if you want to throw it in the comments, we can keep talking about it a little bit. But my follow-up is like, what other picks do you have? Because Nix and Franklin are someone that I think are safe for right now that I probably want to draft over at some point, maybe in the next year or two. Vike rebuilding is so fun. He did that in the startup. Vike, I think if my memory's right, you drafted like four or five tight ends. Maybe that wasn't you, but I don't know why I have that image in my head. But I remember just having looking at because it was an auction draft, like, man, this guy's either gonna just trade these guys away or he might be in a little mini rebuild. So Tim Miller, what's up, my man? I love you, buddy. Tim Miller, the godfather of our soccer program. Shout out to all the Elmhurst College soccer guys that are. I see a couple of them in the chat here. Do you think they were really trying to trade Herbert pre-draft? I don't. I don't think that the Chargers, and I think you've heard some of the reports basically saying that teams called and asked, and they just straight up either didn't field the call or just said no. Like, no, I just don't want to. I don't want to do that. What I do think is interesting about Justin Herbert is that because he has such a lucrative contract and all the rest of the guys are on rookie deals, everyone knows that the cap issues was the reason why, Mike Williams, Keenan Allen, yes, they're older. Yes, they have some injury history, but like they had to get lower in the cap, Joey Bosa and my brain went blank, but in a short version, like they had some major cap issues. So what I think is interesting about Herbert is I do think Ladd McConkey profiles as the wide receiver 2 going forward in that team. And I wrote this in an article probably about 4 or 5 months ago, right after the Super Bowl. And I said that I thought Michael Pittman or T. Higgins going into what we thought would be free agency. I thought they would either get tagged or that they could wind up in LA. And obviously Pittman signed a contract, but Higgins is, T is not, the deal doesn't seem to be going forward. They're going to pay Jamar Chase. Justin Jefferson and Amon-Ra just reset the market, and obviously CeeDee Lamb will maybe not reset it again, but he's going to get pretty close to Jefferson money, maybe more because it's the Cowboys. But he's going to get that money here in the next couple of weeks. So to me, T. Higgins is really interesting because I think he could wind up a Los Angeles Charger. There's just players that, again, values change, situations change, right? Like Derrick Henry goes to the Ravens, probably pushes them into a serious Super Bowl contention conversation. So for me, if you were to tell me that Justin Herbert going into next season had Ladd McConkey as his wide receiver 2, T. Higgins as his wide receiver 1, some combination of running backs because Gus is old and J.K. Dobbins is broken. I like what that means for Justin Herbert's value. I think people who are out on Herbert or who are lower on Herbert would bounce back. The pendulum would swing back in a major way if you told me that you've got a T. Higgins and a Ladd McConkey and they draft another early round tight end or early round wide receiver. I think that would be really, really interesting. Question from John Connor. How many years worth of future picks should you trade if you were in win now? Dude, thank you for that question. That is an awesome question. I think it's really easy to say that you should trade the furthest out that you can, but people don't necessarily want to grab a 2027 first. I would usually go the 2 years out, right? So we're going into 2024, meaning that the 2025 picks are these next year's draft picks. I would trade some 26s. And the reason I say that is you're probably, if you're in a win now team, John, you're probably going to project those as late firsts, late second round picks. So in a 12-team draft, I'm okay with that. In fact, I mean, look, championships live forever. So if you win the championship, then it's worth it. But you're also not giving up a pick more than likely that's going to translate into, what became this year's, Marvin Harrison Jr. And I'll share this with you guys because this is something that I was going to feature on another show, but your question kind of made me think about it. I will either write an article or I'll kind of do it in a segment, but there was I want to talk about the lineage of a trade. And I traded Treylon Burks 2 years ago. I traded Treylon Burks away plus a second round pick. And I got back Isaiah Pacheco in a first, which 2 years ago wasn't great value other than the first because Pacheco was still hadn't really broken out. He was a 7th-round draft capital player, meaning that the Chiefs could have cut him for basically nothing. Treylon Burks had a not so great rookie season, as we all know, but the hope was that, okay, there's nobody there. A.J. Brown is, gone. He's going to be the guy. And DeAndre Hopkins wasn't there. Calvin Ridley wasn't there. So it was like Treylon Burks was, at that time, still a hot name, and I think there was a lot of hope for him. Pacheco has obviously developed into a really solid RB2, and now what I think is probably going to be an RB1 this season. And the first-round pick that I got back became Bijan Robinson, became the 101. So it was a steal of a trade. But at the same time, when you look at the guy who traded it, his roster, it wasn't a win-now roster. His roster was middle of the pack. He thought it was a win-now roster. He thought he was going to – look, we all think we're going to win the championship. And so this is why I kind of said at the top of the show, if you're going to go all in, if you're going to trade to win now, do not mortgage the house. Because if you don't win the championship, you've got nothing, and you could set your team back 2, 3, 4 years. So I think it's really difficult. But again, if you're looking at the next season, I would say, John, the 2025 late first or one of your 2026, that should be totally fine. Hopefully you get that championship. Rasta, I have a team with Cooper Kupp, Mike Evans, Amari Cooper, and DeAndre Hopkins. My other wide receivers are CeeDee Lamb, DK, and Christian Kirk. Start 3 wide receiver, 2 flex, 12-team, full PPR. Stafford and Geno. I feel like I'm in between a rebuild and go for it. You are, and that's the truth of it, man, because look at, I didn't want to show this roster tonight. I'm not going to, but I'm just going to pause, and then I'll come back, Ross, and kind of get to your question here. I have a team that's pretty similar. I have Tyreek Hill, Devontae Adams, Mike Evans, George Kittle, Amari Cooper. Like, it's just old. The team's just old. I think for you, what I would answer this question, what I would kind of talk about for the listeners at home and for the folks that are watching, I would wait until the middle of the season and see where you're at. Because with CeeDee Lamb, you're going to have a wide receiver 5 floor. You're going to have a guy who has the potential to be the overall number 1 wide receiver. He was the wide receiver 1 last season. He has absolutely no target competition. No offense to Brandon Cooks, but the CeeDee Lamb, and that's it. DK, I like. DK's red zone targets. I think we talked about this last week a little bit, but DK Metcalf had a 55% catch rate on his red zone and end zone targets. If he can get that up to the 65-70 range, you're probably talking about a double-digit season. And Christian Kirk's interesting. He's, we kind of forgot about him, but Brian Thomas is a rookie, and Christian Kirk as your wide receiver 3, who's probably going to have a chance to finish as a wide receiver 2 in fantasy. That's solid. So if your team is competing for the playoffs, go for it. It's kind of similar to John's question up top. Maybe trade a late first next year and see if you can't get a piece that pushes you into the championship game and obviously tries to get you that ring. If you're going to miss the playoffs, I think Mike Evans is a great trade-away target to the team that's going to make the playoffs. And the inverse of what I just answered John's question as, I think you can get a first for him. Cooper Kupp, maybe. Amari Cooper and DeAndre Hopkins, you won't get first. You might get a second for Amari Cooper. But to me, I think if you're looking at this group, and I left this comment on the screen because I wanted people to be able to still reference who's on this team. I think if you get to week 6, week 7, and you're 5-2, go for it. If you're 2-5, you might be thinking about some trades. Follow up from Rasta. Quick thoughts on what you would do. I have my 25 first and a projected late 25 first, second. I would see where you're at in terms of, are you going to make the playoffs or not, and then try to add some picks, because the two things that I'll say, this is a good follow up. If you could trade Mike Evans for a late first, and I just saw Mike Evans go for a first round pick in one of my leagues the other day, actually, so I know it can be done. If you were to get some of those first, and let's say you do get a late first because you're trading it to a contender, you now have 3 first rounders. Package that to move up. I mean, that's the key. And this is what we're going to talk about in an upcoming show is picks are currency. And ultimately, at the end of the day, if I have more money to spend on higher value players, I'm probably going to be able to, I'm not buying, since this isn't an auction, but I'm probably going to be able to draft those players. I'm probably going to be able to move from the 108 to the 104. That's a realistic move up the board. And now you're talking about the premier players, premier wide receivers. Maybe next year's running back class is loaded. You're talking about the premier running back group for next season. Another question coming in from Pompano. Is it a good strategy to be targeting wide receivers that will seemingly benefit from better quarterback play, i.e., Darnell Mooney? Yes and no. The yes is the obvious answer of like better quarterback play should mean better wide receiver play, but the talent still has to be there. Darnell Mooney for me is an interesting player because he's probably the fourth option in that offense. So even though Kirk Cousins is an obvious upgrade over Desmond Ritter, I don't see a path where a player like a Darnell Mooney is going to take targets away from Drake London, Kyle Pitts, and Bijan Robinson. So I think Darnell Mooney is a great kind of bench stash in your dynasty teams. I'm in a ton of leagues. You guys know that. I just took Darnell Mooney in two of my leagues late rounds because injuries happen. Guys have, situations change in terms of, what the usage is. I think that for me, what a player that I would look at would be like a Romeo Dobbs. To me, would be a more interesting player than a Darnell Mooney. I like Green Bay's offense more. Christian Watson gets hurt a ton, man. He's just hurt, and I think Jaden Reed is the presumed number one in that offense, but the Packers are super young. We don't really know who the one is going to be. We assume it's Jaden Reed, but a player like Romeo Dobbs, who I have his stats right here, actually, he was wide receiver 36 last year. He went 674 and 8. That's Mooney's probably going to come in at about that yardage range. I don't think he's going to come in at 8 touchdowns. But I think for me, when I'm looking at wide receivers, I'm looking at players who I see a path forward, and better quarterback play to me is going to only elevate them. Like Jordan Addison last year was a really interesting draft pick because of Kirk Cousins. He was never going to be the alpha with Justin Jefferson there. I don't think anyone ever thought that was, the case. And then Jefferson goes down for a large chunk of the season, and Addison was pretty darn good. I don't have his stats in front of me, but I think we look back and obviously they have a different quarterback this season, so he probably loses some value. But I think that was why people were so high on him, and I think that to kind of come back on my buddy Tim's question about Justin Herbert, like to me, Ladd McConkey is a player that everyone is so in love with this season, but the minute that they bring in an X wide receiver, because that's not McConkey's skill set, how do you feel about Ladd McConkey if T. Higgins is there next year? How do you feel about it if Steph Diggs doesn't get re-signed by Houston and somehow winds up, for one season in Los Angeles, which again, it's still an X receiver. So I think that's where, again, I'm looking for guys that I see the path. And so that's, to me, Mooney is fine, but he's, like I said, he's the fourth in that offense for sure. How did I get into a rebuild? My team I didn't have a great draft. I'll be honest. It just wasn't my best draft. And you can see kind of some of the players. I didn't have the full roster here, but it was an okay team. It certainly wasn't a great team by any means, but I traded T. Higgins and Chris Olave away for 3 first-round picks. And there were some guys when I made that trade that thought I got robbed. I should have got more than that. And maybe I should have, but I still look at Chris Olave and T. Higgins. I'm getting 3 first-rounders, and you can see what the value of those picks can become and is worth. I traded Lamar Jackson away for Dak Prescott in a first. Dak Prescott was the QB3 last season in fantasy, finished ahead of Lamar Jackson. So to me, I got basically equal value with a first on top of it. And then you can see some of these other trades. This one was kind of a wonky trade here, but Josh Jacobs away to get a kind of hodgepodge of groups, but I really wanted the first because I knew that Josh Jacobs I didn't like the Raiders. He missed all of training camp. He was on the franchise tag. I like players with contracts. He's in Green Bay now. He's on a 3-year deal. It's kind of a 1-year deal. Mike Williams is always injured. So it wasn't really a sexy trade, but I got a first out of it, and that was really what I was after. And then this was the big trade, was to get rid of Calvin Ridley to bring Jerome Ford and a first in. And that's kind of how I wound up. You can see with all these different first-round picks here in my rebuild. So I'll do another show and kind of cover how currency is sorry, how picks are currency. And I think it's really important to start thinking about them that way. Everybody gets 3 picks at the start. So that's between 30 and 36 picks. Most dynasty leagues are going to be a 3-round draft, and there's either 10 or 12 teams in the league. So if everybody gets 3 and all of a sudden, you start getting up to 4, 5, 6 picks, you're going to be able to either maneuver the board in a better way, or you're going to be able to get, higher value veterans in some of these trades. So this is a really, I think, hopefully a really good example of kind of how to navigate a rebuild, how to recognize when you're in a rebuild. And ultimately, you can see at the top here what I chose. And folks that are not being able to see my screen, I chose to really heavily target running backs in this particular rebuild, because I know next year's running back class is really good, but I also know there's a ton of wide receivers in that class. I missed out on this year's big time wide receivers because my picks were so late. So I basically decided, you know what, I'll draft the best running backs that I can get from the veteran perspective. And now going into next season with Rashad White, Kyron Williams, Joe Mixon, Zach Moss, and Trey Benson, that's 5 guys that I can use on a weekly basis, either in my running back spot or in a flex spot. And the weakness is I have a wide receiver room of Jalen Waddle, Keon Coleman, DeAndre Hopkins, and that's it. That's all I have. So next season, I'm either going to be trading, for veteran wide receivers, or I'm certainly going to be looking at, trying to maneuver a trade up the board to get the higher priced, higher value rookie wide receivers. Or with my team, honestly, I'm not trading my first round pick away for anything. I've gotten offers for it already. I think my team's going to be pretty stinky. So I'm probably going to be picking in the top 3 or 4 of this league. That's where I project myself. And I don't know if Jay Speezy's in here tonight, but I've taken a look at his roster. His team's pretty stinky. So there's the hope, and the best case scenario is that my team and Speezy's team both suck, and I wind up with the 101 and 102 next season. That's the hope, right? Because this is a rebuild. So if that's the case, and I wind up with, the 2 best receivers in next year's class, along with a Jalen Waddle and a Keon Coleman, now I'm starting to feel like, hey, my team can actually compete. My rebuild isn't necessarily rebuild, and I'm probably at least a middle of the pack team, and potentially, if I get some ceiling performances, I may be making a playoff push. And I've got some 26 first rounders. So to kind of come back on John's question from earlier, how far out is too far out to trade? If I'm in that position where I'm like, hey, I was in this rebuild, 2024 was awful. Now it's 2025, and I'm thinking I might make the playoffs. Maybe I trade away that 2026 first, and try to get a veteran that's going to push me into the playoffs or potentially win the championship. So really good insight, I think, good questions. I appreciate that. And Pompano here saying wonderful insight. Appreciate your takes on my questions. Absolutely, man. This is what the show is all about. So want to getting close to our hour time here. So want to jump in and go through the 2-minute drill. We talked a lot about rebuilds tonight, and I want to give you 3 players that I think you can actually go ahead and trade for in a rebuilding team. First one is Romeo Doubs. And I think you can trade away, an older asset receiver, get a Romeo Doubs and get a first, get a Romeo Doubs and get 2 seconds, for whomever you trade away. And the reason I say that is I talked about it a little bit already. We just don't know who the number 1 receiver is going to be in that offense, but we like Green Bay. We like what they're capable of. We love Jordan Love. I don't know that it's going to be Jaden Reed. I think it's going to be Jaden Reed. Christian Watson gets hurt a ton. He went to the Sports Science Center for testing, and he's like, oh, I figured out what's wrong with my hamstring, and now it's fixed. I don't think that's how it works, but that's ultimately like what, he decided to do. To me, again, Romeo Doubs finished as a wide receiver 3, wide receiver 36 overall, 674 and 8. I think he's a guy that you can get as part of a package that includes a first-round player, and he's going to be someone that you could throw in a weekly flex. The second player is Zach Moss. Again, I've mentioned him a little bit already. It's a little bit gross at times. It's not sexy. It's not Bijan. But look, they put him into the mix and roll. I already mentioned I don't think Chase Brown is going to emerge and really take a ton of that snap share and work away. I think if Moss plays well this season, he's going to get another year next year with an offense that we really, really like. And then the last player that I think you can trade for in a rebuild is Kendry Miller. Look, Alvin Kamara's dead cap next year is only $10 million. He's going into his age 29 season. I think it's probably going to be either Derek Carr because he's on a big contract, or a rookie quarterback next year with Chris Olave. They drafted 3 offensive linemen this season. So, the Saints are not a great team. They're probably going to be picking early. And ultimately, I think Kendry Miller, we kind of forgot about him last year, but he's a good player. And Kamara's aging out. And so I think Kendry Miller is a player that you can actually jump in and try and trade for in a rebuilding team who's going to have some value going forward. And again, get Kendry Miller in a first, get Kendry Miller in a second, for a higher value player. Well, that's the 2-minute drill. And as always, I like to finish up with the extra point. So this is a roster I didn't choose to show tonight because I wanted to heavily focus on one that is already rebuilding. But this is another one that's going to be rebuilding. Here's my team: Trevor Lawrence and Derek Carr in my 2 quarterback spots, Josh Jacobs and Kyron Williams, Tyreek Hill, Devontae Adams, Keenan Allen, and Amari Cooper, with George Kittle in my tight end spot. I traded this season. I had 2 first-round picks. I'll come back on those in just a second. I traded this season Evan Ingram and a 2025 second away to get James Cook to come in. I traded, and that was good because I needed a running back. And then I looked at my roster and I said, okay, I don't want to trade Tyreek Hill away because he's my only player that really can hold his value. No one's going to give me more than a second for Keenan Allen or for Devontae Adams. And I floated him. I ton of trades out there and nobody wanted him. And I just traded for Devontae Adams in another league and then flipped him. So to me, like, it can be done. You can get a second. In this particular league, nobody wanted him, so I just couldn't get it done. Nobody wanted Keenan Allen. Nobody wanted Amari Cooper. So I'm kind of just stuck holding the bag. So I thought, okay, how do I do this? Because I'm not going to be able to actually get to a place where I want to be playoff-wise or championship-wise with only 3 draft picks next year. It's not going to happen. And that's something I want to make sure, like, I kind of bring that point up. It is really difficult to try to win a championship if you are not just loaded with studs with only 3 draft picks every single year. So I inverted my thinking process and I said, okay, who is the best player on my roster? I have Jamar Chase. Jamar Chase is a foundational piece, but I traded Jamar Chase away. I got Kyron Williams and 2 first-round picks. So in a sense, I got 3 first-rounders because if Kyron Williams is in this year's draft, he's absolutely going as the RB1 off the board, and he's a first-round pick. Could I have gotten more? Maybe. Probably a little bit, but I didn't want to haggle over it. To me, Kyron Williams and 2 first for Jamar Chase was really good value. And so now I know if I have Tyreek Hill next season, it's probably his last year, I have first-round picks that I can actually have 4 first-round picks over the next 2 years. Now I can start to replace some of these wide receivers. I had 2 first-round picks this season. I had the 107 and the 110, and it was only a 10-team league. So I had basically this, the late first, and I had the last pick of the first round. I used the 107 to draft JJ McCarthy. I don't rate Derek Carr. I think Derek Carr has probably got 1 more season left in him, and Trevor Lawrence just hasn't become the prospect that we've hoped that he's going to become. I actually was on Kendall's show last night. I think the Jaguars are trending down. I think you're probably going to get quarterback 2 numbers from Trevor Lawrence again this season. So I just took the shot on McCarthy, and then I actually traded up from the 110 to the 108, and I took Drake May. I just don't love the 2025 quarterback class. I think it's pretty thin, and ultimately I just don't see a lot of ceiling performances from those guys that are coming out next year. Next year's running back class is loaded. Next year's wide receiver class is loaded. And so I'm going to try to use my 2 first-round picks next year on a wide receiver and potentially a second wide receiver or 1-1, and then see if I can't either maneuver the board to try to use one of the 26 picks to come up and grab an extra guy, or just wait for 26, because this is a really old team. And again, that's why I wanted to bring this up tonight on the extra point, because it is, again, probably a team that's going into a rebuild. And now we spent some time talking tonight about if this is something that looks like your team, now you know how to rebuild it. So thanks for tuning in tonight. Always a good time. I appreciate everybody being here, being active in the Oh, I got one more. Rasta, thanks, man. What are your thoughts on what are your thoughts on tanking to better next year's picks if you know you're not a contender? Also, why is it so important to not trade our own first so you can control and also why it's so important to not trade our own first so you can control your own pick. Yeah, I'm not a fan of tanking. I just think it's crappy, to be honest, and I think your league mates probably gonna hate you. But I don't think you have to tank necessarily to if you know you're not a contender. I think you can go into just kind of a soft rebuild. Maybe trade one or two guys to grab an extra first or a second. I think if you go full fire sale, it's going to be pretty obvious. Guys do it. I've seen it. I've been in leagues where it's been done. It's not my favorite, and I'm not always a big fan of guys that do that because you know what you're doing or you know what they're doing. And I will say this as a caveat: if you go full tank, if you just completely fire sale your team, those picks that you're getting, that's great, but they have to develop into actual players that you're going to use and that are going to become something. Because otherwise, you're just that guy in a league that's got a ton of picks and you become kind of tagged as that guy. It's like, oh, Phil's that guy. He's just always going to have 15 first round picks. He never amounts to anything. If you just keep trading and trading and trading, that's fine. But at some point, you need to draft players or you need to sell those picks for veterans that you're actually going to try to get back into a win now championship window. So I wouldn't go full tank. I wouldn't go full fire sale, but I would maybe look at one or two guys on my team that I don't think are going to be, either valuable for me or they are super valuable, like a Jamar Chase, and I can get a haul and then rebuild that way. Thanks for tuning in to The Extra Point. Again, coming up next week, Wednesday and Thursday, instead of an actual content show, we're going to be streaming two different auction drafts. Again, I am a huge believer that dynasties should start as auctions. You have access to all the players. It's really difficult, to translate. I've only ever been in snake drafts, and now I'm getting into auctions. But I think it's a ton of fun, and everyone that I've ever played in a league with who has never been in an auction has absolutely had a blast and loved it. So check out the shows next Wednesday and Thursday. And then obviously after those drafts are done, we'll go ahead and do a content show where we're going to be talking about some of the different strategies, what I see as some good values. So that way, if you're ready to jump in to an auction draft for your next Dynasty draft, you're a lot more prepared. Make sure you follow along, hit that subscribe button, and thanks for tuning in to another episode of The Extra Point.